to this session of the series on the front line. This is our 11th session of this series, and this is a joint effort by the Resilient Cities Network and the World Bank. I'm Barjor Mehta. I work for the World Bank, and Lena, who will come in just after me, is with the Resilient Cities Network. So we are very happy to have you all here. And let me just, before we begin, let me just give you some the ground rules, because let me just tell you that the intentions of this speaker series is that we have a knowledge exchange, and we have to have an honest learning conversation. So the calls are not on record, and we ask that you do not attribute any comments unless you have the person's express permission to do so. And if you want the permission, we can help you obtain this permission. Please ask us. So we have about 240 plus registered participants on this call today. And so to facilitate the discussion, we ask that you write your questions with the help of the WebEx Q&A function, which is on your screen. And please note that the recording of the session, as well as the PowerPoint presentations, will be posted online by next week or so. So Lena, over to you.
So hi everyone, I'm Lena Poliakou from the Resilient Cities Network, and one of the key aspects of our work is to help cities across the world identify the right solutions that support the resilience building. And there is nothing more powerful than having cities describing their solutions to their peers and talk about the whys and hows of their project. And this is what we're gonna be doing today. We will take a deep dive into one of the most talked about projects in our network, Sydney's Resilient Data Platform. And Sydney will share its experience coordinating a citywide environmental and resilience data platform that provides the evidence base for improved government decision-making. The objective of this session is to influence and inspire others to take action. And we could not ask for a better group of speakers. Monica, Beck, Bruce, and David, thank you so much for joining. So to kickstart the session, I would like to ask Monica Baron, CEO of the City of Sydney since 2006, Chair of the Resilient Sydney Steering Committee, and member of the Resilient Cities Network Board of Directors, to set the scene on what Sydney tried to solve by creating such a platform. Monica, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And Beck, can you put our slides up? Okay, if we could go to the next slide. And then the next slide. Okay, fantastic. So really, it is a great pleasure to be here presenting to all of you tonight. I say tonight because, of course, we're here in Sydney and it's 11 o'clock in the evening. But I know it's different times all over the world. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the work we've been doing here in Sydney, just to set the scene for this presentation on the Resilient Sydney platform, which is one of the projects that we are most proud about. So Sydney joined the Resilient Cities Network in 2015. We were one of the first cities to, be selected when it was the Rockefeller 100 Resilient Cities, and we developed our strategy. And we collaborated with thousands of people right across Sydney in order to develop our Resilient Sydney plan. But one of the things I need to tell you about is that you need to understand the complexity of the governance arrangements in Sydney and in Australia to understand why this platform was so important to enabling us to be able to collaborate and work together. So if you could go to the next slide, please, Beck. So Metropolitan Sydney has a population of about 5.2 million people, but the planning forecast that we all work towards is the 2036 planning horizon, which would see Sydney grow to about 7.5 million people. Now in Australia, we have 3 levels of government. So we have a national government, our federal government. We have state government, so we have 6 states and 2 territories that have their own governments. And then we have many hundreds of local governments. So we're in the state of New South Wales, which is the most populous state in Australia. Sydney is the capital of New South Wales, and Sydney has 33 local governments. The City of Sydney that I'm the CEO of is sort of the the central business and residential part of the city, of the broader metropolitan Sydney. So when we joined the Resilient Sydney network, we were absolutely committed to finding a way to work across all 33 councils in order that we would enable and build a more resilient metropolitan Sydney. And as a consequence of those conditions, we determined that governance was actually one of the greatest challenges we had to become resilient, that if we couldn't find ways to work together, then we wouldn't be able to actually undertake the actions that needed to be undertaken to be able to achieve a resilient Sydney. So we recruited the wonderful Beck Dawson as our Chief Resilience Officer, and we set about developing a plan. You could go to the next slide. Now, many of you will be familiar with the Resilient Cities methodology for developing a plan, so I'm not going to say anything about that, but just to say that when we developed our plan, these were the 5 key action areas that we determined in our consultation across metropolitan Sydney was where we would focus our effort. And you can see the action number 5 is one city, because that is the action that speaks to the fact that we are so disjointed because we have so many local governments, state governments and federal governments all operating in the same space. So if you go to the next slide. So of course, in order to work across metropolitan Sydney with so many players, we need to be incredibly collaborative. We need to have all sorts of processes that enable us to include people from right across the city, and we have to work with many, political elected representatives and political players, and that takes an enormous amount of effort. But one thing that we knew would really assist us was if we could actually all be sharing the same data, that if we could all have access to the same data and all be interpreting that data or having that data managed in the same way, if we could all be using the same data in order to guide decision making, that was one of the things that was really going to unify us. And that is why developing the Resilient Sydney platform was so important and has been such an important tool for our collaboration. Now, it says here that the Resilient Sydney platform, this is straight out of our plan, was going to measure carbon emissions, but can I tell you, it does much more than that, because it looks at carbon, water, waste, canopy, and is also looking at how we can put well-being indicators onto that data platform. So tonight, what we're going to share with you is the platform, how the platform works and how we've gone about populating that platform. I do need to say, though, before I hand over to my colleagues, that this platform was actually developed more than 10 years ago by the City of Sydney in partnership with the wonderful Kinesis, which is a Sydney-based tech company. And we've been collaborating with this company for more than 10 years. And so the City of Sydney was already using this place-based platform. But when we embarked upon working right across metropolitan Sydney through the Resilient Cities work, we then took it upon ourselves to expand the use of that platform right across all of metropolitan Sydney. So we have all 33 councils using the platform. We have 324 platform users from the councils and from the other levels of government. And can I say, it's been an incredible tool, and it's really enabled us to speak the same language, and really build on the collaboration required to build resilience in our city. So now I'm going to hand over to Bruce Taper, who is the head of Kinesis, and who is going to commence this formal presentation. Thank you, Bruce.
Monica. We're just going to do this in 2 parts for everyone. I'm going to run through a short presentation on 5 minutes, and David's going to actually demonstrate the platform and the components of it for 10, and then we'll hand over to Beck. And look, we're a firm that really gets out of bed to make better cities or help make better cities, and we do that with data and technology and analytics. Just following on from Monica, I've attributed a quote to you, but it's something that you said about the work that we've done in collaboration with you and the Resilient Sydney team. And look, we were worried about it as well, because as Monica said, we'd built this platform previously quite a while ago, and we'd certainly used it in lots of our other business as well. And so we've always known that there's never been a lack of data, but because there's been an absence of sharing and collaboration, cities weren't getting the full benefit of it. So look, we built this platform to basically be data agnostic. It can collect and distribute and visualize any type of data. The smarts that we've built into it, that city data is often messy. We work with what you have available and we get the most out of that. And it's all aligned to the GPC protocols and reporting standards that you need, because really what we wanted to build was a single source of truth for climate mitigation and adaptation programs and policy that's robust enough and transparent enough for reporting. So I'm going to talk through two examples that we did prior to partnering up with Monica and the Resilient Sydney team, but they were what inspired us to reach out and have that collaboration. The first one is, as Monica said, right across metropolitan Sydney, a city of 5 million people. So if you look at what we were commissioned by the Greater Sydney Commission, was to explore, this is a very tentative, another level up from the 33 local governments by the state government, to explore what would a net zero pathway for Sydney look like. So the first thing that we started to do was just assemble all the public available data that was out there. Dave, if you go to the next slide. So, you can see right now that that's a very different looking map to Monica's, that energy use, transport use, emissions per dwelling. It's a very rich mosaic in how it's distributed. It doesn't really relate to the governance boundaries that are across the city. And no one had pulled this together. And I think one of the real early learnings on that, we had a number of the government agencies reach out to us wondering how we pulled all that together. And they were quite shocked when we said we pulled it all out of effectively the open data portals. So once you get a great baseline for a city, you can start doing the projections about where those future emissions are going to be concentrated and in what part of the sector of the city. Is it through transport? Is it through renewal centres? Is it strategic centres? Is it urban growth projects? Is it transport corridors? And the other lesson that follows from understanding the city as a mosaic is that you need a different solution and different emphasis for different parts of the city. So something in Western Sydney has very different challenges than something in the eastern part of the city or the southern or northern parts of the city. And I guess what we've always understood about that the policies that you throw at the mitigation and adaptation things need to be cognizant of the spatial factor. The second example was only commissioned about 5 years ago, and this one was really exciting for us. It seemed a small job at the time. It was from the Government Architect's Office, wanted to know how they could green up Sydney. So the first thing that we did was we turned it into a reason to green up Sydney. And like a number of the audience here, members here, Sydney has 3 to 5 months of the year where occasionally it can be very hot for multiple days in a row. And it always makes the headlines in summer. We forget about it over winter. We normally have some significant rain events then. And then we get into summer and things break and people die and lots of people get ill and distressed. So what we simply did was, again, reached into the government archives of publicly available data, found that there's plenty of people that look after vegetation coverage. So we mapped canopy to the city, and you can see it's concentrated in the north. Not a lot in the west. There is stuff in the west, but there's not a big urban population there as yet. Then we mapped where the temperature landed on a hot day, and you can see that Sydney is not a city of 33 cities, it's a city of 2 cities. The eastern part of the city gets the ocean breezes, and the western part of the city doesn't. And then within the platform, the same platform that the Resilient Sydney team use, you can just do a little bit of trend analysis to start understanding some really simplistic but powerful kind of metrics. A 10% increase in canopy cover gives you a 1 degree reduction in ambient temperature at the street level. And then when you start putting all the social and demographic data in there, you can actually unpack why you would also do this. So who is the population and the communities that are sensitive to heat waves? Where do they live? And if you look at that susceptible population, the young, the old, the people that can't afford to run a air conditioner 5 days in a row, they're where there aren't trees, and they're where we've got to put a lot of growth in the city. So the platform ended up telling the government where and how many trees they should be thinking about. And one of the things that most excited us about using data this well and making it so visual, that within 3 months of being commissioned to do that work, the New South Wales Premier announced the funding of $40 million to plant 5 million trees by 2030. And so that really inspired us to reach out and go to Monica and Beck and the Sydney team who we'd been working with, if you go to the next slide, Dave, to basically say, we've been working with local governments or municipalities individually, but there's this huge ability to share the data. So we proved, when we built out the platform, we wanted to prove it could work anywhere. We did a simple pilot where we loaded up data that was publicly available from Toronto, San Francisco, New York City, Mexico City, and Buenos Aires. But really we wanted to start with Sydney. So we reached out to Monica and Beck to say, we have all this data that's freely available, that's assembled by the public sector. We should be using this. So Dave's now going to demonstrate a live demonstration of the platform. So it won't be slides. We'll be showing you how Beck and her team work with it, and we'll be showing you how the council offices across all the 33 councils, I think Monica said 300 plus, use it. So you can do data analytics and visualization, saving net zero pathways, something that the cities used to pay consultants like us to do quite a lot of money, and collaboration and sharing, so that you can engage not just with the other 32 councils, but with the level of government above and private infrastructure providers as well. So Dave, over to you.
Bruce, so yeah, I'm going to dive straight into a live demo because just bring it up. And yeah, as Bruce said, show you a little bit how users engage with the platform and how it can be useful. So when a user logs into the platform in the Resilient Sydney network, they see the Resilient Sydney dashboard. Now, this dashboard shows the metropolitan view of emissions, where they can easily see that mosaic that Bruce was talking about before of how greenhouse gas emissions plays out differently across a metropolitan area like Sydney, areas of low and high emissions. It enables them to also benchmark themselves. So we've got these 33 municipalities. How do they benchmark themselves against each other? One, to find similar municipalities to collaborate on programs and policies, so they can find policies and programs that work across those areas. In areas that have similar emission profiles, similar transport challenges, similar waste opportunities, or simply start to gamify it a little bit. How do I compare to my peers? Why am I going better or worse? And how do I improve? But we've also set up dashboards for each of the 33 individual municipalities that make up metropolitan Sydney. So the city of Blacktown, for example, one of the largest growth areas in Western Sydney, can navigate to their dashboard, which includes the reports and analysis that's relevant for their area. They can see their emissions by place, by suburb across their municipality. Again, showing that any city that we land on with the data isn't the same. It is different, and they can see those differences. And they can see the different, their emissions by sector. So for a growth area like Blacktown, they can see that residential single dwellings make up the largest proportion of emissions in their municipality. And they're going to continue to grow as new areas are developed, with industrial areas the second most important. So very quickly they can cut and slice this data in a way to help them understand where to focus their efforts. Now, just as a reminder, and Bruce mentioned this, the data didn't come to us in this perfect format. it came in different geographies, different sectors, different subsectors, but our software and methodology enables it to be transformed in a consistent framework so cities can use it to do work. Now we're tracking this data year on year so cities can see how things are trending up or trending down at an aggregate level, aligned to that GPC reporting standard for that sort of annual aggregate view of electricity, gas, transport and waste. But they can also track at an individual technology or program level, like electric vehicles, or in this case, solar PV. So the chart we're looking at here shows greenhouse gas emissions across the last, shows solar PV take up across the last 7 years across the city of Blacktown. And the different coloured bars show the size of the panels as they're being installed each year. A couple of things that are really interesting about this chart immediately is that we're seeing this huge growth, about 40% year on year, consistently across those 7 years. But what's really interesting is over the last few years, there's been this big jump in large solar PV installations, which is starting to reflect the change in market and the cost of solar panels in Australia. Importantly, this is not just a series of static dashboards. So wherever you see a chart, all the raw data is available to analyze and actually do work. And that's what we get really excited about. And there's a couple of examples that I want to show you on how cities are using it for that. So if I was the city of Blacktown and I wanted to better understand solar PV, I wanted to understand where I should focus a PV policy and explore this data further. They can explore this data further within the platform. And they can quickly understand how installations are playing out spatially across their municipality or their city. And they can see areas very quickly that have a large number of installations or areas that have a small number of installations. They can normalize this though to better understand the take-up or penetration of solar PV. So we can look at number of installations per dwelling. And we can see areas like Marsden Park, one of the growth areas in the city of Blacktown. About 35% of dwellings there have solar PV installed. Where there's also some of the more high density inner city, but also lower income and different socio-demographic areas of the city where the take-up is very low, 6%. So quickly again, as a city officer, I can quickly filter down the data, cut and slice it, and understand where I should be focusing my efforts, whether that's the sort of communities I should be engaging with, or the types of dwellings and policies I need to create to respond to that. The second example I want to run through focuses on electric vehicles, a topic that's pretty high on the agenda for many cities at the moment. So if we go back to the chart that I showed before on the Resilient Sydney dashboard, where we saw how cities were benchmarking each other across metropolitan Sydney. So we can see here that city, Blacktown, large growth area, contributes to a large part of metropolitan cities' emissions. But if we analyze this and look at not the aggregate emissions, but the emissions intensity of these areas, it tells quite a different story. So if we just zoom in on the residential sector and we look at emissions per dwelling. So now we're looking at emissions intensity or emissions per dwelling across the different municipalities in metropolitan Sydney. And you can see that story kind of flips around a little bit. The outer areas of metropolitan Sydney, Camden and Hawkesbury, have much higher emissions per dwelling than some of the inner city areas of metropolitan Sydney. And this is largely driven, and we can see on this chart, by transport emissions. More than 50% of those emissions are driven by transport. So we can filter down into the transport emissions. And now we're starting to get into the raw data that goes into the platform. So we're not talking in emissions anymore, we're actually talking in kilometres. So for Hawkesbury, 60,000 kilometres on average per dwelling. We can dive down one layer further and see that the bulk of that is from private car use. So areas, as we would expect, in the outer areas of metropolitan Sydney, low access to public transport, high car use, high car ownership, which equates to high car use and high transport emissions. So even just surfacing this data, a city officer can look at, okay, 42,000 kilometres per dwelling per year at about $2 a litre for petrol. That's about $10,000 that households there are spending on fuel. Switching to an electric vehicle could save residents $8,000 a year or more, depending on the price of fuel and petrol, and reduce transport emissions by about 40%. So these two examples, I guess, show how we've taken that messy city data, transformed it into a way that in the platform that can be used for the development of those net zero policies and programs, and how it can be shared across a metropolitan area. And the second thing I want to demonstrate is setting a net zero pathway and how this data is used to do that. So we've linked this tool and the data in this platform to a net zero app for cities. And the purpose of this app is to enable cities to rapidly calculate then emission reduction pathways for their city. This replaces, and something that Bruce mentioned before, what cities would have paid consultants tens of thousands of dollars and taken months to do. I know it because we did it. We did, and we have been engaged by cities to do that as consultants. But it can now be done in minutes, and it remains live and dynamic, and it's all fed off the data in the Resilient Sydney platform. So if we go into the Net Zero app, let's focus in on Blacktown again. As soon as I select the area I'm interested in, the app instantly gives an indication of my carbon budget, so the amount of emissions that I can emit before I exceed the carbon budget for my area. It calculates emission reduction pathways under various policy contexts and what those emissions would look like going out to 2050. And importantly, it allows a user to see the contribution of different policies and interventions to those emission reductions. So I'm going to show you two examples here that around building standards and electric vehicles. An area like Blacktown, the city of Blacktown, a growth area of Western Sydney, a lot of new development that's expected to happen in the future, and that's sitting there in the app. So if there's no change, you can see on the left-hand side here, users can toggle on the various policy inputs across stationary energy, across transport, and across waste interventions. And so if we go up to the top and look at residential building standards, so how do we affect new development, new residential development? If there's no change, you can see on the right-hand side in this panel, there's no emission reductions from that policy. If I implement a net zero building policy by 2030, you can see I'm going to achieve a 1.25 megaton reduction from that policy. But if I bring that forward to impact of the development that we know is going to occur from next year, the impact of that policy triples to nearly 4 megatons. So not only is the tool dynamic in allowing city officers to understand the implications of these various policies and interventions for their city, but it also shows the cost of delay, which is obviously pretty important and significant when we're talking about getting to net zero by 2040 or 2050. The second, similarly with electric vehicles, if we scroll down to some of the transport interventions and just look at electric vehicles, if I start to enter some of the expected EV take-ups that are happening in Australia, you can see that EVs is already more significant than residential building standards. But if I look at accelerating EV take-up to 100% by 2040, it becomes the hero policy, and it also achieves some of those affordability outcomes. I know I'm running out of time, so I'm just going to close with one thing that I think makes some of this analysis really exciting, and it relates to the collaboration element of it. Users can create as many policies as they want and compare and save them in the platform. Oops, how do I get rid of that? Yep. And they can compare them to a baseline, but importantly, and various policies, a more aggressive EV take-up, a rapid electrification, they can see how they compare But importantly, they can share all of this and do it in real time with their teams. So I can share this with Bruce and say, hey, look at the transport policy implications. Do they make sense from our city planning perspective? They can share it with the various levels of government to collaborate on as well. So Bruce and I guess, have talked a lot about, we built, I guess, this out for cities to become a single source of truth of emissions tracking and net zero pathways. We've talked a lot about the data and the software side, but I want to hand over next to Beck, because we know that this software needs to be bundled with a program of engagement to ensure we get the outcomes that we're driving for with all of this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce and David. This is a very impressive platform, and I'm sure lots of our participants will have lots of questions for you. But before we get into the questions, let me introduce Beck Dawson. She's the Chief Resilience Officer, and from what I read about her, she's paid to worry about Sydney. And I can imagine, having worked with local governments in my line of work, herding cats would be an easier and far more efficient way of working than herding so many local governments. And so Beck's job is to, she leads the Resilient Sydney program, and she works with all the 33 local governments there. She has a background in strategic systems and organizational change programs for resilience and sustainability, and has a master's of sustainable architecture and a bachelor's in science. So with that, Beck, over to you.
Thank you so much, Badra, and thank you, Monica, Bruce, and David, for getting us to this point. Hopefully everyone can see, I guess, the power of the tool, but my job today is to talk about, what are we kind of using it to really leverage, and what changes are we really starting to see happen in our cities, and how are councils and our kind of city governments using it. So I think, firstly, just to kind of stating the obvious, but the climate emergency, as many of you will have seen in the news, is very real in Australia. And I guess from our point of view, what we've discovered is we are not yet really equipped enough as users and city leaders to understand that information really well, so that we can drive the change quickly enough to match the expectations of our communities who are really facing these changes in a very real, live and a disastrous way. So we really need this new generation of environmental accountants. And so a big part of this program is really about equipping all of the people in our city to be able to use the data. It's one thing to have a tool, it's another thing entirely to have people excited and getting in to use it. So they really need to drive that investment to reduce emissions. They need to drive adaptations. You can see how it can work, but what are they going to use it for? Who are they selling it to? So that needs to be that kind of investment grade data reporting and that standard method with a standard methodology. So we're really capacity building for resilience. In terms of the global context, for those of you who are reporting in other parts of the world, we are aligned to the global protocol for the community scale greenhouse gas emissions. And that document's super useful. It enables that kind of cross accounting methods, understanding different activities, and you can see that in the presentation from David. But what it really talks about and the way we are using it in Sydney is as city-induced reporting method primarily. And that's because we're trying to line up those activities and the impacts with real actors in our city. So what things are coming from houses and who are the audiences that need to understand that information? What is the kind of emissions and the profiles coming from industry or business, and who do we need to engage in that front? So in Sydney, we now are using this data. To date, we've been running this platform now, we're in the 4th year of running it. We have 14 councils who are now actively pursuing major net zero plans. And we describe these as real investments for, prospectus for investment into how we make emissions changes. We've got 16 councils now across our 33 doing local resilience plans and using data in the platform to make decisions about what they're going to change. We've got 28 councils now driving really major urban forest strategies. You heard Bruce mention that earlier. And 24 councils in the last round using this platform data for land use plans. So we're starting to get, and I think it's an evolution and a maturity model of people beginning now to really layer this data through all of their plans through the city, but it takes time. When each council has access to the platform, they then go through and think, well, how can they use it? They use it politically for things like obligations for reporting under the Global Covenant of Mayors. They use it to report to their community, they use it to target those actions, and obviously then to engage different communities. I'll just give you a couple of other examples from our program, just to give you a sense of how that works. So the Randwick City Council, as an example, has pulled a collaboration area together. Major university from the city, major big race course and turf club, major health precinct with one of the largest hospital precincts that we have in the city, and some other education establishments nearby. That whole precinct has come together and used the platform to understand what are the major issues that we need to cover off together, and they've brought that group of people together to collaborate for a net zero precinct. In Penrith, much further out on the other end of the city, in the far western edge of the city, which is very hot, we have, Penrith has used that to look at the solar matrix in the way that David described, but the city government did not have enough money to focus on all the different parts of the city to drive a solar system uptake. So what they did was really focused on the 1 or 2 suburbs that were really low levels of take up for solar on their roofs. Hosted a couple of workshops that really also brought all the neighbours together, and it's had a spectacular impact with a really big uptake in new solar systems going into those areas that previously had very few. So in terms of the collaborations, what we see is, this joined up decision making, ability to align our targets, put the data in plans. We've got 324 users now, and we do offer handbooks and support with 6 to 8 major webinars a year, and then often a few others on particular themes or collaborations we might be running with the state or other parties involved. To date, we've delivered more than 3,500 hours of training, and I think I wanted to put that in just to give you a sense of how much effort is really driven in the capacity building. I reckon that's really more than half of what we're trying to get done here, is bring everybody with us, give them the experience and the confidence to really use this. But it's also been a major cost efficiency saving because we're doing it together at scale instead of all 33 working individually. And so this sort of engagement process is really underpinning excellence. It's really evidencing the key challenges, helping us set targets, understand risks, report and engage with politicians and city leaders, but also the public. And that consistent, reliable public interest data, building confidence, and really enabling accountability across our governments. And part of that's that all of them can see themselves in the data set. They can see who they are, they can go into their areas, but they can also see everybody else's. So we're sharing that information across the piece. For me, this is what resilience is all about, this definition we use and we talk about it, but we're trying to live and breathe it here with this platform and really driving data into it. But we need the capacity of everyone in our city to try and understand this information, act on it to really make the changes we need to stem the challenges that we're having to live with in the climate emergency and, frankly, the resilience challenges of our city more broadly. That's it from all of us today. We're really excited to hear questions and obviously engage further with anybody who wants to know more about the platform or the engagement and capacity building programs. Thank you to all of our team today for pulling it together.
Hey, thank you to all of you, really, for a very engaging set of presentations. I'm sure you will realize that there are lots of questions. But since I have the floor, let me start by asking all 4 of you. What exactly how did you go about getting this done? I know this must have been an extremely difficult task. How does one start? Let's assume that all 33 had come to the table, but how does a city start to build a platform like this? It's a broad question, but you might want to answer all 4 of you might want to answer parts of that question. Thank you.
I might start by just talking about actually getting the commitment and the money to do the job. So essentially, the City of Sydney was using a very similar platform, and people, of course, I mean, as you can see, it's such a powerful tool because you can go in, see the data in a way that is, but place-based, down to suburb level. It's so easy to present what the challenge is. Obviously we were focused on on emissions profile, but we also have water, we have waste, and we have Canopy, and we continue to build the data sets that are on there, right? So, you know, we have this fantastic tool that was enabling the City of Sydney, which is one of the local government areas, to make really good place-based policy, evidence-based policy. And so people were starting to be interested in that and asking how that could happen. I think when the City of Sydney signed up to the climate emergency, however, and because we'd had the great work of the Resilient Sydney group, I essentially took it to our Lord Mayor and said, look, we are working against the clock here, and unless we roll out tools and capacity building across metropolitan Sydney, we will never achieve the deep cuts and the work that needs to be done to achieve, to deal with the climate emergency. And so the Lord Mayor agreed to fund the first $1 million to roll the platform out to all of these other councils. Now, this is really unusual because we are all separate local government areas. Now, all the councils pay in a contribution now, and of course, the more valuable they find the tool, the more that they do. But someone had to lead and had to put the money up to get this happening, because we were only going to prove its worth by getting people using it. And I'll just say one other thing. The other thing is then that, of course, not only do we use the data to talk and compare, we use it to then do collaborative policy work. So the City of Sydney then has recently developed and endorsed its net zero building pathway, but we developed it in consultation with all of those other councils. So all those councils can take it to their councils and adopt a new planning policy, and then they can put it into the platform. And as David showed you, and then they can click a button. I know I make it sound easy. And they can see how, if they implement that policy, what that does to their emissions profile. And so we can work very quickly, which of course is so important.
And so maybe I can take the next part, Monica, in terms of just, I guess it was also tricky to then get all the other mayors and all the other actors engaged and then really comfortable with having all their data shared quite widely. Even though it's public data, I think, what we were really interested in is all the organisations taking some accountability, control, but also feeling confidence that they could then report the data to their communities. So we did bring everyone together very early to talk about what were the risks of making this data available, what were the benefits, how would each individual council understand their challenges. What we have done in the user profiles and sort of there is a bit of a mechanism behind the governance to help keep it safe, I guess, for everyone to play and use the area. So we have a terms of use which says that if you're a user on the platform, and these are all government users at the moment, of course, then you only report publicly the information that pertains to your area that you have jurisdictional control over. But you can see everybody else's. So everybody signs that agreement. There are some legislative frameworks that we all report to separately, but of course, it's important for us all to use and see that have that safe space in the middle to be able to work together. So that did take a little while to negotiate with everybody, to find the right mechanism, to find the right way that people were comfortable and felt safe with the way we would drive it. If I just say at the beginning, there was a lot of consternation about, can we do this? But a few years in, like, everyone's just like, can you put the next data set on? We want the next one, the next one, the next one. What else can you give us? Social data, well-being data, and those are the things that we're looking at now. So I think it's also a maturity of all of the users that comes with the experience of having that time using it together, and building confidence in the numbers and confidence in the methodology and the delivery of the program.
And Baja, from Kinesis's point of view, I think we can really ratify what Monica and Beck just said, because obviously we've worked historically with different clients, individual clients, and when there hasn't been that sharing and collaboration, there's no efficiency. So the training and programs that Beck and the team have run have been like just dumping intellectual property on hundreds of users at the one time and steering them through a collective process. So it's made it a safe environment for them to engage and discuss. And we've seen that manifest significantly, because we certainly have local government areas in Sydney where the mayor may be not as ambitious as what we might be as individuals, and they're nervous about it. But there's nothing like showing data to show that you're not alone in this. and they can see the other 30-odd councils with the same challenges. So that's been part of the transformation. As we said, historically, wherever we work in Sydney, other cities in Australia or globally, there's data out there. You just need a safe mechanism to pull it together so it's reliable and robust, and that's what we've done.
Thank you, Alan. There are several questions at the chat that would be great to try to address. One was around whether you tried to overlay on top of the hard data, kind of more citizen-led science and perceptions. So have you attempted something like that, or is it in your plans? I don't know. Beck, do you want to take this?
That's a good question. So, and we get asked it often, actually. And I think there's potentially, opportunities to do that going forward. At the moment, we've steered clear of that, partly because what we have found with some of the citizen data and some of the more real-time data, whatever format it comes in, sensor data, for example, across the city, is it's coming in, it's often a little bit patchy. It needs a lot of cleaning up to be able to report cleanly. And what you need to do to create it into a benchmark is quite complex. And this tool doesn't have that capacity. So we've kept sort of live data off to the side, and we're really using this platform as the core benchmarking tool for the city. So it's driving those structural long-term targets, the structural performance measures and mechanisms that allow you to see it over time. Sensor data, you can do that with sensor data too, but obviously needs a lot of cleaning and analysis in order to give that kind of insight. So we do have some other platforms in Sydney that actually collate a lot of sensor data in different places of the city. It's not connected completely together, but there is an opportunity to still do that and obviously connect those pieces together. At this stage, we haven't got there, but it's we'll put it on the wish list.
To add to that, look, I think it is not to be underestimated the amount of money and time and effort that has gone into getting quality data into this platform. Because remember, I mean, one of the things I always say is one of the reasons that I was really driven to do this, apart from, being committed to, responding to the climate emergency, was that I was watching people left, right and centre make decisions and spend money on things that were not going to make any difference. And it is extremely frustrating. And they could get away with it because the data, it was not being exposed. That policy decision or that investment, the lack of the inefficiency of it was not being exposed. So, I mean, I know I'm being a little bit harsh, but the point here is we have limited time and we have limited resources, and they have to be driven to very effective action as quickly as possible. And so we're really focused, so the robustness of the data and the ability, the investment to ensure we keep collecting it is absolutely critical to our credibility. Having said that, the opportunity for citizens to play and engage with this is all there. I mean, we talked about, some of the local governance areas being able to drill down on suburbs where they wanted to change a behaviour or change investment, and they could do it really locally and get a result and see that immediately. One of the data sets that we don't have on there yet, which we're really keen to get on, is the take-up of green power. Now in Australia, and we've been we've been a bit backward, but now in Australia, the majority of Australians want to see action on climate, right? So that means at least over 50 or 60% want to see action on climate, but only about 1 or 2% by green power. And we have no way of showing that because we cannot, at the moment, the accreditation body that looks after the green power does not collect the data by postcode, and so we can't put it onto the platform. So we're all advocating collectively right across the country to have that changed so we can have a source of data that shows citizens what's really going on. But we can also have fun because with that, we will be able to say, hey, Redfern, you're doing better at buying green power or planting trees than Glebers. How do you feel? That's fantastic. Glebe, you're really going to let Redfern get away with that? You want to be behind them? Come on. So we can also play with it in that way. But, I'm not actually interested in, I'm interested in getting those layers that are robust and we can continue to repeat and that cannot be questioned because of their robustness.
Just quickly to add to that, from a data platform perspective, the platform itself is data agnostic in that we can throw any data at it. But I think, and the point that Beck and Monica make is that when we look at city planning, resilience, climate action, what our challenge has been from the software provider as part of this collaboration has been, how do we take all the messy stuff that's out there but make it robust for decision making? And that's where the methodologies that we've built up over time help do that, so that we know that there's always going to be data challenges. We know cities have different levels of data. Some of them are really coarse grain, some super fine grain, and a mix in between, some patchy, some really complete. But we can't wait for perfect data to get it. And that's where the collaboration with the city and Resilient Sydney has been really great, in that we've started with filling in the gaps with the methodologies and then building the data relationships with the data providers to improve it over time. So we do have that robust temporal element of data that cities can engage with.
Thank you. So I'm going to put together two separate questions that have come through. One is, what happens to jurisdictions that hold out? Let's say you have a metropolitan area, but then there's one holdout, what in China we call the nail house, that the guy doesn't want to move. So what do you do with a jurisdiction that doesn't want to be a part of this and it's part of the metropolitan area? And a related question is that, what about cities who are not happy with the results that you're presenting, and how do they come back to you and said, hey, we don't want you to present our data? So that would also be a little patch out there if they didn't allow you to use the data.
Do you want to take that?
I can answer that one. Yeah. So on the public data front, the great questions, Barbara. On the public data front, because as you can hear, the data is effectively public information that we're then just presenting. So actually, no one can prevent us from providing it as such, in the sense that it's information that's in the public domain. So at a really idiot level, yeah, no, it's on. Like it's on and it's available. We have had people who have said at various times they want to be less involved, but I think what's been great about the capacity building workshop is that we're all really working together. We're all trying to get broadly the same things to happen. And so even if you have a government that's not so keen on climate change issues, and they have a kind of a council which might not be that way politically inclined, they might actually be using it for transport and for other activities, and because there's a whole range of data, as you can see, or looking at waste efficiencies in their programs. So even for those organisations that might not be looking at all the parts that we offer, they're still using the information underneath. So and because we're providing the training in different kind of structures in different ways, we're kind of able to engage with those different actors and still get them excited about finding a use for it. So the answer is, we've had a few conversations along the way, but so far every time we still have them coming back around and getting on board, because I mean, as you can see, it's pretty sensible, right?
Yeah, but can I just add to that? I think, but what I just want to add though is this, as Becca said, the data is there, and of course our goal is to bring everyone on the journey, for everyone to want to collaborate, to enjoy, to really, be engaged and want to participate in this. But, there's another side to this, and it's about accountability. In Australia, when the climate emergency was called, I can't tell you, hundreds of councils signed up for a climate emergency and then proceeded to do nothing. That's not okay. You cannot go to your citizens and say, we signed the pledge, but we didn't actually do anything. So, this is also about citizens holding people accountable. It's not about talk. Climate action is not about talk. And all of this effort is not just because we enjoy, playing with data. If with any decision we make, we have to ask ourselves before we spend a cent or spend 1 minute on it, is this actually going to be useful to actually make a difference, right? And that's why, going back to that earlier question, if it's not going to make a material difference, then we don't have time for it. And so, there's a lot of policy, there's a lot of rigor that goes into everything about the work that we do with this platform, right? Including those conversations.
The alternative is, having worked in local government many years ago, that often local government officers work in a city and the map of their city won't show anything else surrounding it. It'll just show their particular piece of the pie. So sharing it has been transformative. We've also had council staff who have shown maybe climate skeptic elected representatives on the city councils that over a third of their electorate has invested their own money in solar PV cells. So when they've said that they don't believe in solar or something, that when they see their own residents are using it with, like Dave said, a 40% increase in growth, it's changed their approach to what's going on in their community. So it's been incredibly powerful having the collaboration and just the data to show where everyone actually is as opposed to where people think they are.
And most mayors don't want to be the mayor that was left behind. So there's a lovely bit of competitiveness that comes with it when they see someone else get a headline because they bought more electric vehicles than someone else, or they did something more than someone else. You know, so we're also playing with that.
Thank you, Monica. And just because of time, one last question. So, I mean, the purpose of this session was to provide inspiration and inspire others to act. So, one question for the Kinesis representatives here, and one for the Sydney group. So, what are the foundational arrangements you need to have, both from a data perspective and from a governance perspective, to be able to set up such a platform? Beck, Monica, do you want to start, and then go to the data aspect?
So you definitely need to have a really clear method about what you're here to do, and I think that idea that we described before of this is a benchmarking reporting platform with really quality standardized data that Monica was mentioning earlier. You know, we have a written methodology that really drives that, and that's really a kind of set of principles about how that works that has enabled us to kind of underpin the governance of what we then share. Who are we sharing it with? Who's it for? So we've been really clear it's for local government users to drive change in very particular policy areas with really robust quality data that's benchmarked and able to be shared. So I think, you know, those sort of basic principles of how it comes together in a method and a governance arrangement have been absolutely critical. And you do have to make those decisions up front about who are your users, what are you giving to them, and what are you asking them to do at a really idiot level, and how you're going to, you know, keep them going and keep them together, and, you know, really give them support and structure to help them to do that with the capacity building.
And I just add one thing to that, because we're running out of time, is that, I mean, I think one of the reasons we've been able to do this is that the City of Sydney administration has been very constant. So the Lord Mayor has been there since 2004. I've been there since 2006. And so we've been able to build and keep building. You know, of course, everything, again, we do is always with the view that it's got to be very hard to undo. Right, but it's been that, you know, ability to constantly build on this that's enabled, because if you can't start and drop and start and finish, you know, you've got to keep going, you've got to invest in it, because you also need that data over many years. And I think the team are really I think we're not hearing enough about how much work they do to collect that, to extract that data and put it in a form that works. I mean, I think, Beck, it took you nearly 2 years to get the canopy data, you know, so don't, you know, to convert what's there into something useful, also recognizing that there are gaps because different local governments collect their canopy data differently. So we're also trying to get that consistency around how people collect their data locally, so that then when we put it into the platform, we've got the same data. So sometimes we have to configure that with those inconsistencies. And to Kinesis?
You know, from a technology point of view, just as Beck's team services all their participants, we've got a support desk that are available to all the users just online instantly. So there's a lot of stuff goes on there. As Monica said, a lot of the, you know, kind of cutting and slicing and getting the methodologies of the data collection right is important. But, you know, in that sense, the data's been transformative because it's been shared. That's the most powerful thing I can say. Councils and cities have always had data in spreadsheets or GIS tools or visualization things, but they've never had a safe collective thing where they can collaborate. And when you think about the problem we're addressing, it's not a problem where Sydney can exceed and Blacktown can fail. We all have to succeed if we're going to address this. And that's the collaboration perspective. And that's why the Resilient Cities program is so powerful, because it's focused on cities. It's not at a state level, it's not at a federal level, it's how we're making better net zero cities.
What a great way to end, because really we have to give a shout out to the Global Resilient Cities Network and the enormous support that they provide us all across the world.
Thank you, Monica. And I would just like to echo a comment that we have here, which says, I just want to say that this is the most inspiring and impressive piece of work I have seen in years. So I echo, and I think also the rest of the World Bank and Resilient Cities folks echo that sentiment. Thank you so much for your time. It has been a great discussion, and I'm sure that there are many other comments that are coming. So thank you all for joining this session. We have the next session will be actually on the 13th of October on small businesses and how they build urban resilience, and we will focus on cities in the southeast of Asia. So stay tuned for that. Monica, Beck, Bruce and David, thank you so much on behalf of the World Bank and the Resilient Cities Network for your presentation today. So have a great rest of the day to all of you.
Thank you.
We're going to
Thanks,
bed.
Lena.
It's midnight here.
Thank you, everyone.
Some rest.
Thanks so much, everyone.